I just want to offer a warning that I've already given some of you. So last night, as I was sermon prepping, and it wasn't even the midnight hour this time; it was like 6, which I am growing. And I was watching Formula One Drive to Survive because I have a need for speed. And as I was working on my sermon at the end, I know in the font I like and the size I like about how many pages the sermon is going to be. But I write it in the little font so that I can trick myself, like, oh man, I still have so much more to go. And then when I make it big, I'm like, that's enough. So yesterday, it was a lot. So I text a pastor friend of mine, Christina, and I said, how many words are your usual sermons? And the number she gave me was far less than what you're getting today. But it looks like we kind of got through the front part pretty quickly, so I have good time. You can file a long sermon report with, you can file it with Melody. So file your sermon too long reports over there. But as I prepared today, I didn't bring my book up. As I prepared today, there is so much goodness in these texts and so much for us to carry with us now. This morning, my child is in for spring break, which means that I had two choices, go broke or meal prep for him. So this morning at 8 o'clock, I was making salmon and meatballs and chicken tenderloins and asparagus. And I just felt so motherly. Usually he's away, he's like, hey mom, can I get $99 for this new baseball game? And I'm like, oh, okay. But actually cooking this morning, and I was thinking about Shifra and Pua, and I have some really good zingers in here today, some alliteration one-liners that I was very proud of. And I thought about how the text never leaves us without a witness. When we look at our social location, I've talked to you quite a bit about that. Miguel de la Torre talks about it in Reading the Bible from the Margins. When I prepare, I always want to see the problem of the text, like what was happening then. But then I'm like, well, what's our problem now? Because they are all very similar. And this week in Prone to Wander, it was no different. I could see the clear lines between what they were going through under that king and what we are going through with our self-identified similar one. But the text does not leave us without a roadmap. This week we have a blueprint, one that will show us how to resist tyranny, how to move through oppression with holy defiance, and how to make choices knowing that our liberation is bound together. Today, what we've read and what we'll talk about at first glance looks to be about a show of power. And we understand that. We navigate power. We see how it is used, how it is abused, how it violates. But beneath that power is actually fear. It is fear that has put on a mask and is masquerading as control. Pharaoh was afraid. The Hebrews were multiplying, flourishing even under oppression. And rather than reckon with their humanity, he sought to contain it. He decided that their lives itself was a threat. And when power feels threatened, it does what power always does. It chooses violence. He issued a decree to destroy Hebrew baby boys and enlisted 2 midwives, Shifra and Pua. Shifra means harmony, and Pua is splendor or utterances. He called them to be agents of genocide. But these women, bold, God-fearing, and unwilling to bow to empire, had a different kind of calling. Shifra and Pua feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. Midwives, as they are today and as they were then, were trusted figures. They welcomed babies in during the most vulnerable time of the moms and the babies' lives. Their hands were meant to guide into this new world, to hold what God was delivering. But Pharaoh wanted to use their calling as a weapon. He ordered them to kill the very children they were meant to usher and protect. But they refused. Shifra and Pua understood the cost of defiance. They knew that Pharaoh was not the kind of man to take their disobedience lightly, but they also knew something greater, that there is power beyond Pharaoh, sovereignty beyond empire, and a God who honors those who choose life in the face of death. When questioned, they did something that has always been a tool of the oppressed. They used the oppressor's own assumptions against him. Pharaoh believed Hebrew women were different, less fragile, less needy, less like the dainty and beautiful Egyptian women. So when he demanded answers, my homegirls leaned into a lie. They said, Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are strong. They give birth before we can even make it there. It was a bold risk, a necessary strategic move. Their resistance echoes across history. I think about the ways Black women's bodies have been both demonized and exploited, how racist myths were used to justify pain, how Marion Sims, the so-called father of genealogy, experimented on enslaved Black women without anesthesia because of the belief that Black means you feel less pain. The same stereotypes that later made way for their suffering are the ones that Sefer and Pua used to subvert Pharaoh and to protect their people. But resistance provokes retaliation. When Pharaoh realized the midwives would not comply, he took the violence further. Now, instead of just ordering the midwives, just look, everybody who sees any, throw them into the Nile. When oppression meets resistance, it does not back down, it doubles down. A second decree was given, throw them in the Nile, but leave the girls alive. And prone to wonder, Joanna mentions that if he knew how so many of the women were plotting against him, he would not have let the girls live. I was like, you know what, girl, that is interesting, because the way I see it, I have seen women and non-binary and gender-expansive people carrying the resistance on their broken and violated backs for so many years. You would think he would have been like, let them all go, but he did not. Every now and again, the patriarchal notion that women are unnecessary and not a threat works in our favor. Pharaoh wanted all those boys thrown into the Nile. The river that once gave life would be turned into a mass grave. And in the shadow of that decree, a mother gave birth to a son. Jochebed knew that before her baby ever took his first breath, that his life was already under threat. He had been given a death sentence. She carried him in secrecy, birthed him in silence, hid him with trembling hands for 3 months. I don't know if any of you have been around a baby, but what a wonder. Every single cry was a risk. Every movement a reminder that she could not keep him safe forever. But when she could hide him no longer, she made a choice that no mama should have to make. She wove a basket, sealed it with tar, and placed her baby in the river. But not just anywhere. She placed him in the reeds where he would be seen. She stationed his sister nearby to watch. She did everything she could to give him a chance, and then she let him go. I feel like this is literally, all I kept thinking about last night was like, Lord, Moses was up a creek without a paddle. And I'm like, I wonder, is that where it came from? And I'm like, probably not. It doesn't seem very Hebrew. But I can't imagine what that could feel like. That would be a pain too deep in that level of surrender. The very river meant to drown those boys became the thing that carried her son forward. The waters that swallowed so many others she entrusted with her baby. Some of us know what it means to place something precious into the unknown. Not because we want to, but because we have no choice. To take a step without knowing the outcome, to release something with only the hope that God will catch it. But let's pause here. Because sometimes we read this as if she just let him go with no direction. Woe is me, here's the baby, whatever will happen. But I don't believe that, not for a second. Jochebed did not simply release this 3-month-old into the unknown. I believe she positioned him. Sometime after Jochebed placed the baby along the riverbank, it was time for the royal daughter's bath. I side-eye this part of the text, similar to my friend Joanna, because why she couldn't get a name? What if Moses was just the child of a Hebrew person for all Exodus? Like, we would feel some kind of way about that. But she has such an important part. But nevertheless, Pharaoh's daughter, an unnamed woman in a house full of power, steps into the story. And her actions speak louder than any title that she could be given. When she arrives at the river, she does the thing that I just wish more people would do. She notices. She hears the baby's cries and she does not harden her heart. She opens the basket and does not turn it away. She recognizes him as Hebrew and does not call for his execution. Instead, the scripture says she had compassion. That compassion could have cost her. Pharaoh's own decree was clear, and yet here she was, lifting one from the water. In that moment, she made a choice, one that aligned her not with the power of her father, but with the resistance of the midwives, the defiance of Jochebed, and the watchful hope of a big sister, Miriam. And before she had time to wrestle with the decision, as some of us are wont to do, on my good high anxiety days, I can't decide what side of the bread to put the peanut butter and jelly on. And it is important, and you may not think so, but there is a side of the bread that my brain deems better. But before she could go back and forth with her own self, Miriam slid on in. Oh my goodness. Shall I find a Hebrew woman to nurse this strangely placed right here where we knew he would be baby? And just like that, this baby who was placed into the unknown is returned to the mother who let him go, who would now be paid to tend to him. The very empire that sought to destroy him now is the source of his survival. Pharaoh's daughter does not simply rescue Moses, she conspires. Whether she knew it or not, she became part of a holy rebellion, one that would set a stage for the deliverance of a heap of people. This moment reminds us that sometimes help comes from unexpected places, that even those raised within systems of oppression have a choice to make. That compassion, when acted upon, can be a form of defiance, and that God is always at work in these spaces, doing things we cannot predict, moving through the hands of those bold enough to resist, even in Pharaoh's house. This is what happens when defiance meets divine timing. Jochebed placed her son into the unknown, and God orchestrated his return. A Hebrew mother, an Egyptian princess, a watchful sister, two defiant midwives, all playing a role in God's deliverance. Because liberation is not a solo, it's a choir. Always interwoven, always a testimony of how God moves through the hands of the willing. I know that this week was by thy help in the devotional, but all I kept hearing as I read was be thy help. As prayer goes, that may not be the one you pray often. You may not be praying, Lord, let me be thy help. You may be praying, Lord, let somebody help. I remember the first time I prayed a version of this prayer. I asked God to break my heart for the things that break theirs. What happened was I had heard it in a song, and William McDowell made it sound so good, and it was like, shut-da-da-da, break my heart. And I said, oh my God, I'm adding that. That'll be great. So that night, I prayed it, and I did not know that God would be like Amazon Prime, and within 2 business days, he delivered a response to that prayer, and I became like the weeping and wailing women in Jeremiah. I saw everything, I felt everything, every injustice, every unkindness, every piece of it. I was undone. It was internal mayhem. But I learned 2 things. Number 1, before you go into a new prayer season, be prepared. Kind of know what you're getting into. Explore and investigate the possibilities of what happens when God answers. And 2 was that I learned that I have the capacity for more than I ever knew. I could not see these things and not do something. I had to grow covert and creative in the ways I loved, the ways I served, the ways I advocated, and the ways I fought for liberation. And in this season, that is what I believe this text and this season and our God is calling you to do. We have to use what we have. And history teaches us that when we use what we have and when we wield it wisely, it is enough to change the course of nations. When we look at movements of liberation, time and time again, we see that power is not only in weapons and warfare, but in the sheer force of nonviolent and collective resistance. Studies show, because I looked it up, that nonviolent resistance is twice as likely to succeed as violent ones. Research by Erica Chenoweth found that nonviolent movements led to political change 53% of the time, compared to just 26% of the time for violent uprisings. Why? It's not because we bring treats and water to the protests. It's because nonviolence brings strength in numbers. It allows for a broader coalition, pulling in others from every demographic, disrupting society at a level where the empire cannot ignore us. And not the empire that strikes back, but empire as in political. Okay. It's not about who has the weapons. It's about who has the people. And this is what we see in Exodus. Pharaoh had the armies, the chariots, the laws, but the women had something better. Shifra and Puah had their defiance. Jochebed had a desperate faith and a well-placed woven basket. Miriam had her voice and a strategic mind. Pharaoh's daughter had the courage to wield and leverage her privilege for the sake of a child that was not her own. None of them carried swords, yet their collective resistance unraveled plans and set in motion a beautifully diabolical escape. This is what it means to be thy help. To know that God isn't only moving through force, but through faith-filled disruption, through boldness in the face of power, through the undeniable force of a people who refuse to comply with their own destruction. Shifra and Puah didn't just pray that God would deliver their people, they became the answer to the prayer and became the deliverance. Jochebed didn't just pray for her child's safety, she acted in faith and was willing to risk everything. Miriam didn't just pray for her brother's survival, she positioned herself to be part of a plan. Pharaoh's daughter didn't just feel compassion, she made it a verb, she moved in it. The world is still full of decrees that threaten life, policies that oppress, systems that destroy. We cannot only pray, God, fix it. We got to be part of the fixing. We have to move, we have to resist, we have to use what we have, even if all it is a well-placed word, a refusal to comply, a strategic move that helps life flourish instead of perish. Psalm 21:1 says, I will lift up my eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help. Yes, our help comes from the Lord, but don't miss it. We are called to be the help. To be the hands and feet of Christ in a world that still decrees death. To be subversive instead of submissive. To lean into our connections for our collective freedom to take risks when the time demands it. That time is now. That people is us. May we be bold enough to answer the call. The word of God for the people of God.